Let's start in the jungles of ancient Mesoamerica, home to the Maya and Aztecs. Most people think of human sacrifice and leave it at that. But for the royals, sacrifice wasn't just a show. It was a personal, bloody commitment. Aztec emperors weren't just rulers. They were divine intermediaries. And if crops failed or drought struck, that wasn't nature's fault. That was the emperor's soul growing weak. The solution, a little self-sacrifice. And by a little, I mean piercing your own genitals and dripping your royal blood onto sacred cloth, which was then burned as an offering to the gods. In some cases, the emperor would perform this ritual in public, with thousands watching. Imagine the pressure. But it didn't stop there. When a new emperor rose to power, he had to lead a military campaign. Not for territory, but for captives. Prisoners of war were brought back to the capital, not for negotiations, but for ritual sacrifice. And if you're wondering, yes, the emperor had to personally wield the obsidian knife. To rule was to bleed. To rule was to kill. And that was only Monday. Now, jump east to the Persian Empire under Zoroastrian rule. Here, fire was sacred, the holy embodiment of truth and purity. But fire could also be deadly, especially if you were a threat to the throne. One of the most disturbing rituals of royal succession was called the Trial of Flames. When a new Shah was chosen, especially in times of dynastic dispute, he might be required to walk barefoot through a path of burning embers. He emerged unharmed. He was chosen by Ahura Mazda, the supreme deity. If he screamed, fell, or blistered, well, too bad. The divine said no. This wasn't metaphorical. There are records of candidates being dragged out mid-burn, skin falling off in sheets. It was a political test disguised as religious ritual, and many claim it was rigged. Some candidates were given protective oils. Others had their paths prepared with cooler coals. And here's the twist. It wasn't always the candidate who burned. If a prince suspected his rival of corruption or heresy, he could demand a fire trial on the rival's advisor or wife. If the poor soul perished, the rival was tainted and exiled. A ritual of purification. Maybe. A power play soaked in ash and fear. Definitely. The Scythians. Nomadic horse warriors of the Eurasian steppes, known for their skull-collecting, gold-loving psycho-warrior culture. But did you know their kings participated in a form of cannibalistic communion? According to Herodotus, when a Scythian king died, the ritual wasn't just burial. It was massive, grotesque theater. First, a mound was prepared. Then the king's horse, wives, servants, and bodyguards were strangled or sacrificed to accompany him into the afterlife. But here's where it gets worse. In some versions of the ritual, the brains of the sacrificed servants were collected and mixed with fermented mare's milk, then consumed by the royal family and nobles. Why? Because it was believed this would transfer loyalty and power from the servants into the living lineage. In other words, eat their brains, ingest their loyalty. Secure the throne. Oh, and they didn't waste the skulls. Those were cleaned, polished, and used as drinking cups at the next royal feast. Raise your chalice, salute the dead. Long live the king. Ancient Egypt, land of pyramids, gods, and eyeliner. But behind the grandeur of temples and tombs was a ritual so cruel, it was whispered only behind palace walls. It was called the living foundation ritual. You see, when a new temple or palace was being constructed for a pharaoh, it was believed that the building had to be anchored spiritually and physically to the land, not with bricks, not with stone, but with blood. Slaves or prisoners, often young virgins or beautiful foreigners, were buried alive within the foundations. Some were placed under cornerstones, others beneath thresholds. Their screams were muffled by limestone, their bodies crushed slowly under the weight of centuries. Why? Because the pharaoh believed human spirits would guard the structure, binding it to the eternal favor of the gods. There's archaeological evidence, too. Skeletons found curled beneath palace foundations, sometimes with hands covering their faces, suggesting they were fully conscious when the final stones were set. In Egypt, you didn't just build monuments to the gods, you fed them. Now we move west to medieval Europe, where monarchs ruled by divine right. But what happened when a king was deeply sinful? When his reign was marked by bloodshed, adultery, heresy? Well, enter the senator. This was a real job. A poor, desperate soul who was paid to take on the sins of the dying king. At the moment of royal death, the senator would be brought into the bedchamber. There, a loaf of bread and a bowl of wine, symbolic of the king's sins, were placed on the corpse's chest. The senator would consume them, literally eating the king's corruption. Some monarchs performed this ritual while alive, to cheat hell early. Imagine a young king, just 25, watching a sickly old man eat bread from his lap, whispering incantations like, "Your lust is now mine. Your greed is now mine." And here's the twist. Senators were never allowed to be touched again. People believed they were walking prisons of evil. They lived in isolation, hated, feared, but kept alive. Just in case the king needed a second round. You don't get more twisted than that. Outsourcing your damnation. In ancient China, the emperor ruled under the mandate of heaven. But this divine blessing could be revoked, especially in times of natural disaster or rebellion. So how did emperors prove they still had it? By performing bizarre public rituals that blurred the line between devotion and torture. One of the most shocking, the ritual of endless kneeling. The emperor would kneel in the temple of heaven for hours, sometimes an entire day, without food, water, or speech, under the blistering sun or freezing wind. The idea was that heaven would watch this ritual, and if the emperor collapsed or showed weakness, his rule was illegitimate. To make it worse, the emperor often self-flagellated during the ritual. Not with leather, but with whips made of sharpened bamboo, slicing into his back while chanting apologies for the kingdom's suffering. The people watched. The court watched. Heaven, they hoped. If a comet appeared, or a drought ended shortly after, he was restored. If things got worse, well, some emperors were forced to abdicate within weeks. It was one of the few times the emperor had to beg like a mortal. And it was brutal. We return now to Egypt, and to a ritual not marked by daggers or fire, but by bedsheets. To preserve the bloodline of the gods, Egyptian pharaohs, especially those of the 18th dynasty, engaged in ritual incest. Brothers married sisters, sometimes fathers married daughters. And yes, even sons were groomed to marry their own mothers. Why? Because their blood was divine. Mixing with commoners would dilute it. And purity wasn't just symbolic, it was law. The most infamous case, King Tutankhamun. Genetic studies show he was the child of a brother-sister union, his own wife, his half-sister. The result, Tut had a club foot, scoliosis, a cleft palate, and may have suffered from multiple genetic disorders. Some historians believe he couldn't even stand without assistance. The twisted irony. The ritual meant to preserve godlike power created a king who could barely walk. Our final stop, India. Ancient Vedic kings were said to undergo a final ritual before declaring themselves living gods. The Amrita test. According to legend, a true king could drink a concoction of cobra venom, powdered arsenic, crushed datura seeds, and survive, because the gods would not allow him to die. This ritual was sometimes performed in secret, sometimes during grand coronations. Some kings, historians suspect, used diluted poisons and prepared their bodies through long microdosing over months. Others, dropped dead before the crown even touched their heads. But here's the catch. Even in death, the ritual worked. Because if a man was willing to die for godhood, maybe, just maybe, he had already become divine. Or maybe, just another corpse on a golden throne. So next time you think politics is dirty, Remember the Aztec king who slit his own skin, the pharaoh who buried virgins beneath his feet, the emperor who bled in silence beneath a wrathful sky, the queen who married her own brother, and the king who drank death itself, just to prove he could. Power has always demanded a price, and in the ancient world, that price was soaked in blood, bound in bone, and written in ritual. You survived 30 minutes of the darkest corners of royal history. But the question is, would you have survived being royal? Subscribe for more forbidden history. And remember, behind every crown, there's a corpse.